I'm just waiting for all the attendees to make it out of the waiting room and make it into the room. I think you can think of this as the moment where everyone is rushing through the doors to come and see the keynote speakers. And I just want to make sure that everyone has a chance to get in and take their seats because this is going to be a really wonderful conversation. Um, Thanks everyone for joining us. We've got so many friends in the network and so many friends attending this who are from global majority countries, particularly for our friends in Africa and Asia. We've got people calling in from late night time zones. We really do appreciate you coming and joining us, particularly our friends in Indonesia and the Philippines, where we've got 10, 11 p.m. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. In this webinar, we're going to be using the Zoom Q&A function for the audience to send in your questions. We really do welcome your questions. I'm going to be reading through them, and I will end up putting them to the panelists and to the respondents. You can find the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Each part of this, we're going to make space for speakers to answer the questions and have a chance to respond. So hi, welcome. I'm Ethan Zuckerman. I'm Associate Professor from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I direct the Initiative for Digital Public Infrastructure, which is a research lab focused on the future of civic technologies. I'm also a senior fellow of the Global Technology for Social Justice Lab, GLOTEC for short, which is a wonderful project here at UMass Amherst. And GLOTEC is one of the hosts today for our event titled Reforming Tech and Democracy Programs for the Global Majority. This is the celebration of the launch of a really ambitious collaborative study that's been a year in the making. It's called Custom Built. In Portuguese, it's called Feito Sob Medida. And the idea is that this is a roadmap for tech and democracy programs to be better designed and better custom built with the global majority in mind. The report makes the case that there's an enormous tendency for the global north to sort of impose its way of looking at democracy and tech accountability projects on the global majority. And actually, there's an enormous amount to be learned from collaborations like this one between researchers and visionaries in the global majority. So this report lays out a vision for tech accountability. It centers those global majority voices. It celebrates the creative capacities of those civil society workers. And we're going to hear the research team talk about evidence they've gathered from research with civil society leaders, with academic donors, with other activists and voices in the global majority. We're going to talk really with the events of the last few weeks in mind. Where does our field go from here? What's the future for tech justice and tech accountability? Where does disinformation research go from here? What are the institutions and resources that we're going to need to be able to do these sorts of critical tech studies in a global context? So before we get started on the report, before we dig into these questions further, let me just share a few words about our event hosts. This event is co-hosted by the Social Science Research Council and by GLOTEC. Social Science Research Council, often known as SSRC, is an independent international nonprofit organization founded in 1923. It fosters innovative research, nurtures new generations of social scientists, deepens how inquiry is practiced within and across disciplines, and mobilizes necessary knowledge on important public issues. Within the SSRC, the Just Tech program supports diverse cross-sector cohorts of practitioners through a fellowship committed to identifying and challenging injustices emerging from new technologies. The Media Well project tracks and shapes the fields of study that inform technology policy, curating and amplifying new research, and connecting it to contemporary policy issues. Our other co-sponsor is the GLOTEC Lab at UMass Amherst. GLOTEC is a creative hub and trust network for scholars and practitioners at the intersection of critical tech studies and global studies. It's led by 5 communication faculty members with a team of senior fellows and grad students. GlowTech's research program this year is focused on South to South as theory and method. You can connect with my colleagues at glowtechlab.net. I encourage you to sign up for the newsletter and for fellowship opportunities that are going to be announced soon. But we really want to get into this amazing report, and I want to start by welcoming the study's authors, several of the study's authors. There's a number of people involved with this, but we're lucky to have 3 with us today. Jonathan Corpus Ong is lab director at GlowTech, the Global Technology for Social Justice Lab. He's my colleague, he's a professor of global digital media at UMass Amherst. We're also very lucky to have Marcelo Alves, assistant professor in the Pontifical Catholic University de Rio de Janeiro, better known as PUCE. Marcelo is working on a new book on the January 8th uprising in Brazil. And I know that he's very focused on some recent revelations that have just come out about a very scary assassination plot in Brazil. We're also incredibly lucky to have Raquel Requero. She's professor at the Federal University de Pelotas. She's the author of the new book, The Disinformation Network, which is based on 6 years of research into disinformation systems in Brazil. These 3 are going to present for about 25 minutes. We'll have time for 5 expert discussants to give their short responses to the study. Feel free to put some questions in the Q&A. I'll end up moderating that, and I promise that we'll have lots of time to talk about that. Jonathan, let me hand it over to you to start.
Well, thank you, Ethan, for hosting this event, and thanks to SSRC, our colleagues, for co-hosting this event. Special thank you to colleagues and graduate students of GlowTech Lab who have obviously supported this work. And thanks everybody for joining us, especially those who participated as respondents to our research. So it took a whole village, or more accurately, several villages, to complete this study. And if I may invite our SSRC folks to flash some of the event sponsors and institutions that have hosted and supported this work. We had to link up various institutions here in the US, in Brazil, the Philippines, and Canada to complete this paper that we're launching today. Of course, 2 of my co-authors are with me in this panel. We want to acknowledge our other co-authors, J.M. Lanuza, Dean Jackson, Camila Tavares, and Rafael Groman. Of course, our team wants to thank Luminate for supporting our South-to-South network building project that has taken us from Amherst, Massachusetts to beautiful Rio de Janeiro for our network building events. And I wish we were having this event in Rio. So my colleagues and I at GlowTech Lab have a vision for the tech justice space to be more globally minded and community driven. And applying these principles requires significant time and investment. So we thank all those who have supported us through our work. And if I can invite our organizers to flash the report and the design of our paper, we want to thank the designer of our study, Yanni Kim. So you can now see the cover of our report. So our cover art illustrates lanterns and lamps as objects of illumination. And of course, this is meant to represent insight and enlightening the path forward. And these are also cultural artifacts in the process of repair and revision and collaboration, which I think, conveys our paper's key argument. So thank you again to Yanni Kim, our designer. Next slide, please. So we'd like to tell you the main objectives of our project. So first and foremost, our team wanted to produce a very practical record of global majority frontliners' lived experiences, their challenges and accomplishments. So there's a whole appendix that you can dive deep into where we discuss examples of groups and their interventions in great depth. So we wanted to capture their challenges and frustrations and dwell and understand that. our report wants to make a provocation and present opportunities to reform and, have these challenging conversations. So the second objective is to inform funding programs and practices by articulating our vision for just spaces of global governance, as well as good, effective, and custom-built programs. So Dinita Putri is one of our funders, and our conversations with her often go, Jonathan and team, you keep criticizing, mainstream platform accountability programs. So can you tell us exactly what do you want us to fund instead? So in a way, this report is our team's response to this practical and challenging question. So we draw from civil society groups various experiences. We contribute more precise analytics that can help researchers, donors, international collaborators discern what are just spaces of governance, what are sustainable communities of practice, and what are good, effective, custom-built or fecho sobe medida projects. Finally, the third objective is to map out different visions of tech accountability. So we analyze the geopolitics of the space and critique unjust systems of knowledge creation and applications of interventions. So this means for us understanding points of divergence between global north and global majority tech advocacy. And we want to reflect on harmful outcomes of tech for democracy interventions that, are sincerely well-meaning, but what are those harmful and unintended consequences? So our intention in publishing this open access report is ultimately for civil society groups to use it as a tool for advocacy. We hope that global majority activists feel seen by this study, and they use it to engage their other collaborators to help design more just spaces. Next slide, please. So our project began as a conversation between Brazil and Filipino researchers, and we wanted to apply principles of South-to-South exchange in disinfo research. We produced earlier studies comparing media democracy interventions that took place in 2022 in the Brazil elections and also the Philippine elections. So these two countries have shared experiences of authoritarian nostalgia, historical experiences with dictatorship. Brazil, however, had a more favorable outcome in their election. So Filipinos were especially curious to learn what did Brazil do right, so to speak. So other inspirations that we wanted to draw from were inspired by colleagues Andrea Medrado, Sebastian Lewede, Payal Aurora in decolonial digital studies. So we borrow critical perspectives about colonial legacies and oppressions that are opened up through South-to-South research, the analysis of knowledge and data extractivism, and also attention to everyday creative insurgencies. And these are concepts not often present in mainstream disinfo research. So of course, we embrace the term global majority as a more empowering term that allows minoritized peoples to define themselves outside their relation to whiteness. So other inspirations, so the anthropology of the aid industrial complex, examining the role of funders and the measuring of good projects. Members of the team also share a worker justice lens in our approach to disinfo work. Rafael Groman and I are co-editors of a recent special issue for Social Media and Society on disinfo for hire as everyday digital labor. I see Craig Silverman in the room, obviously referencing their work. And it's interesting how they draw from a lot of global case studies to come up with this frame. So we want to focus on precarious labor of tech workers and how that is a generative entry point to studying disinformation. Likewise, we're inspired by Alice Marwick and colleagues for the critical disinfo studies framework that they lay out. So in summary, our team brings with us a globally minded and community-driven approach to tech and democracy. We look beyond techno-legal solutions and reject platform determinism in our analysis. And to tell us more about our methods and South-to-South applied, I now call on my colleague Marcelo Alves.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Hi, everybody. I'm Marcelo Alves. I'm assistant professor in the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, where I lead a lab called Media Technology and Data focused on disinformation and platform studies. It's such a pleasure to be here and see the results of these 3 years collaboration coming to light. In the past 2 years, the Brazilian and Filipino teams have published 3 studies. They compare disinformation trends, tech accountability, and civil society responses in both countries. The reports are available online in English, Portuguese, and Filipino. This current paper has a broader scope. It captures perspectives of participants from human rights, journalism, digital rights, donors, government, and researchers. We conducted in-depth interviews and held 3 global majority knowledge exchange workshops, one virtually and 2 in person with over 100 participants in the last year. The pictures you're seeing is from the workshop in beautiful Rio de Janeiro last year. The workshops, they function as focus groups where participants were invited to respond to our research questions, as well as share their own experiences. Last November, Jonathan and I, we hosted at my university in Rio de Janeiro a 2-day event with over 45 participants. We convened with representatives from India, South Africa, Moldova, Indonesia, and other countries that faced election in 2024 to hear lessons from Brazil and Philippines civil society. The workshop was bilingual, conducted in both English and Portuguese, which is traditional for events held in our universities. It included Brazilian government leaders and election coalition members who justified strong legal responses to election disinformation in our country. We indeed had very interesting debates about it. Participants in India and South Africa challenged the Brazilian legal responses as too aggressive. They argued that such measures cannot be applied to countries where political incumbents have direct control of the courts. Our workshop also convened smaller breakout panels focused on practical tips for researchers at risk, which is so important right now, both in Brazil, Filipino, and US, and how to build transnational coalitions that offer mentorship and personal support. And I'll turn it back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Marcelo. I definitely miss that event and hope we get to do more over the next year. So the key finding based on our interviews and workshops is that frontliners have experienced the tech and democracy space as fostering what we call an illusion of inclusion. So we came at this finding from talking with civil society groups from very diverse backgrounds. So obviously, usual suspect groups come from media and journalism, digital rights, cybersecurity backgrounds who are more familiar with this space. But we also interviewed organizations new to tech and democracy work, come from more traditional human rights backgrounds. So our respondents, first of all, share that they benefit a lot from international collaborations in this space. For those coming from countries where funders are too politically squeamish or traditional in their programming, these international lifelines have been essential to their innovation and survival. However, a common theme across these participants is they experience mismatches between the projects that they want to carry out and the central challenges and priorities that are relevant to their country context. So while civil society organizations have joined so-called whole of society coalitions at global and national levels, many have come to resent some of the extractive work arrangements, the hijacked agenda, and redirected organizational mandates that come with their participation. So whole of society as a framework makes a case for multi-stakeholderism, but we argue it does not in itself have a theory of power. What we need is a more critical language and precise analytics that can help bring attention to power inequalities that play out in this space. So beyond metrics of effective and scalable programs, what we need are ways to discern practices of data extractivism, knowledge extractivism, and anticipate risks wherein legal strategies might be captured by or co-opted by institutions. And so how does research and advocacy might get redirected? So Our study gives focus to 3 different donor categories and examine them in great depth in the paper. So these include, of course, big tech, global philanthropies, and global north governments, foreign aid. So a lot more work has been done on big tech funding, how it shapes the space, and we reference the work of folks like Lucas Graves, Thales Lelo in our research. Allow me to focus on number 3, on global north governments and their foreign aid programs. So what we see here is that a lot of the projects that are funded are more aligned with global north governments' foreign policy and militarization agenda. With the heightened geopolitical tensions in Europe and between US allies and China, what we find in the global majority is that organizations have been incentivized toward hunting foreign influence of Chinese and Russian operatives. So in our paper, we quote journalists and researchers who experience this. We also capture their narratives of refusal to participate in these projects. And we find it important to show the ways that local actors resist the imposition of conflict frames in favor of pursuing solidarity, healing, and collective care projects that they find should be more of a priority. Next slide, please. So here I want to spend time to retell 3 stories to illustrate competing visions for the space moving forward. We had said that we want to understand moments of divergence between global north and global majority, but this can also be between more mainstream and more critical approaches, between techno-legal approaches, and more civil society-rooted strategies. So these are 3 stories that I hope capture some of these divergences for us to discuss later on. So the first is when Southeast Asian civil society organizations mobilized under the hashtag #PushBackUNESCO in May 2023. These organizations met in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and expressed alarm over UNESCO's guidelines for the governance of digital platforms and published an open letter. So they asserted that the guidelines would justify domestic over-regulation, empower illiberal regulators, and fail to protect human rights activists. UNESCO portrayed the guidelines as whole of society, as a product of a global multi-stakeholder consensus. One of our workshop participants was a signatory to this letter and called this disingenuous. So in our report, we discussed this under the category of analyzing the geopolitics of tech accountability, specifically critiquing the typical direction of policy flows. And this direction is often from global north to global south. Of course, because of frustrations with their governments, even activists from the global south often assume and accept this policy flow, that regulatory institutions have to come from elsewhere. We tell this story in our report as something empowering from the perspective of global majority tech activists who were able to call out this typical direction and saying, had you consulted us first, we would have said no to your proposal and we would have refused to fall in line with this agenda. So the second story I want to tell is at the level of national coalitions, specifically the quality of the composition of election-related coalitions. So in our study, we make a distinction between, on one hand, tech and tools-first coalitions versus those that are more methodologically diverse. So this specific distinction came from our comparative work between Brazil and Philippines election integrity coalitions. So in the Philippines, we observed the election coalitions were quite rigidly defined around the methodology and tools of fact-checking. So over 100 organizations enlisted to apply fact-checking tools to be part of the coalition. So what we found was that many examples of groups like those specializing in legal advocacy or even grassroots youth empowerment had to suddenly pivot their work to produce more generic media literacy interventions in order to be part of the coalition and avail of Global North funding from tech corporations. Brazil, in contrast, had a different model. So we call this in our report, fighting a battle across multiple fronts. Brazil's coalitions were diverse, heterogeneous, inclusive of even sectoral organizations, environmental groups such as Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund, invested in counter-narrative strategies to combat climate disinfo. Academic researchers worked to inform legal strategies and also the design of counter-narratives. So we found that modeled after climate justice coalitions, the Brazil approach leveraged the traditional strengths of each group while making space for new creative collaborations. So the third story is about competing visions of tech accountability that we discern from listening to tech activists. One approach is focused centrally on big tech platforms and keeping them as the main target. And another approach tries to decenter platforms in favor of more civil society-driven initiatives that include more diverse kinds of approaches, from worker power movements to community healing, to voter literacy, to deep investigative research. So this doesn't have to be an either or, of course, and in our study, we discussed the value of combining both approaches. So we discussed, for example, how global majority tech activists often focus their energies in auditing platforms' promises and what big tech has promised as a set of tools. And it's about auditing whether they have rolled out these tools to all countries quite equally. So this approach meets platforms on their own terms and doesn't provide really structural critique and holding them really accountable. So another concern from our workshop participants is about platform determinist explanatory frames. And here, drawing from the work of Robin Kaplan and colleagues, this is the idea that platforms are solely responsible for social ills and various electoral surprises pulled off by authoritarian leaders and how they brainwash so-called uneducated voters. So participants who do grassroots work find such frames tone deaf and alienate ordinary citizens. And our report has also tried to gather a range of civil society perspectives. Why centering platforms is sometimes not productive. So we had some participants reporting how platforms would poach their own staff, obviously, and sometimes even bringing them to risky situations, such as organizing meetings with government and military actors who are actually hostile to their organizations. So that's a way in our work where we talk about how centering platforms is one approach that's valid, but we need to bring in other kinds of more civil society driven approaches and really see tech and democracy from a more big tent coalition kind of strategy. So what are some examples of this? Some organizations lean into the worker power frame, the focus on empowering tech workers, cultivating whistleblowers, providing them legal resources, and we reference the case happening in Kenya, for example. Some target local disinformation economies, exposing disinfo for hire firms and influencers for hire, using the long and challenging work of investigative journalism that sometimes gets overlooked nowadays. And others focus on citizen empowerment and community healing through digital literacy and hosting deliberative mini-publics. So what we heard from civil society groups is that some of these projects that are not centering platforms are hard to get funding for. So funders don't find these programs sexy. They don't find that current metrics that favor scalability and transposability of tools and strategies as favoring these kinds of civil society rooted strategies. So next slide, please. So what our study hopes to present and make useful for designers of programs and donors and international researchers, we create these tables that provide analytics that can help them make better distinctions when designing tech and democracy spaces on one hand and also projects on the other. So focusing on space building first, we talk about the design of just and sustainable spaces. And here we present different categories of power relationships, top-down or bottom-up, knowledge production, where do the flows of policy come from? Does it enable contraflows of ideas and the exchange of ideas from majority world to the global north? There's also coalition representation, which I've discussed, and also time frame. The next slide gets us into projects and programs. And our report, again, gets into more granularity around disinformation mitigation, tech accountability, and voter literacy. And I think it's timely that we're having these discussions now as well in the wake of US elections. Many of us in the disinfo space are in the process of a lot of soul searching in terms of what worked and what didn't. And of course, this discussion can get very sensitive. Some folks, I see a posting on Twitter and Blue Sky that, disinfo studies got it all wrong, or deplatforming was never the right approach. And these are valid discussions, I think, for us to have and work through. But we're happy to share from the perspective of civil society groups in the global majority that how they have gone through their own rituals of soul searching and how certain groups get blamed rightly or wrongly. And we hope that you find that useful. So finally, the last table I want to tease and share here, it's important to stress that when we talk about global majority, it's also not a monolith. There's a lot of internal diversity here. So we also present recommendations relevant to country context, again, to kind of highlight and anticipate ways in which research and advocacy might get co-opted when institutions are captured or weak, or when the media sector might be captured, when civil society is fragmented, or if there's lack of trust between researchers and practitioners. So to help us summarize all of this is Raquel Requero. I hope you can help us close out our presentation.
So thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everybody. So we had a few discussion questions okay, right. So first question, what can global majority countries with longer histories of authoritarian backsliding share with the US and the world in terms of supporting activists and scholars at risk? This is a very hard question, and what we experienced is that one of the key lessons is how quickly these actors are silenced and marginalized and subjected to online attacks and deprived of support, especially economic support. So, for example, in Brazil, one of the first things that happened was that the support for more critical research and particularly social sciences was completely dehydrated. So these people need a support network to better develop their knowledge and critical thinking, enabling them to address issues such as extreme polarization, radicalization, and threats to democracy. The more we study, the more we uncover similarities across different contexts that can help us better understand the challenges that we face today. We underline this in our report, and one key example is the interplay between disinformation systems and platforms, and how it is essential to create spaces for these discussions to take place, safe spaces, where people can share knowledge and learn from each other. What's a good first step for non-government funders to create space for global majority-led work? And what would you like to see happen in the next 6 months? So I think we need multiple strategies, not just one. I would advocate for increased support for research, especially since topics like disinformation are often unwelcome under more extreme governments and situations, and they can pose risks to scholars. So, as we mentioned, researchers now require greater economic, political, and social backing more than ever. As I said, in Brazil, as the far right rose, public funding was it's the biggest funding for Brazilian researchers, and it was very difficult to have access to this type of funding, and it was very directed to specific areas such as military research. And because of those changes, some scholars left Brazil, a lot of scholars, and the country still didn't recover for this exodus, this intellectual drain, for example, and the consequences are still here. And activists, they also need support because they also leave the country. What I'd like to see is the birth of a network, a system that can provide this type of support effectively, that can discuss with people how to be safe, how they can be able to do their research, how they can have spaces for discussion and publication. Third question, how can global majority better articulate an alternative vision for critical tax justice advocacy as the US government steps back from leadership position in the space? This is also an excellent question. As tech companies are still mostly based in the US. So I think that one key approach is to leverage diverse but unique perspectives, centering local expertise and fostering collaborative networks to better understand the complexities and the similarities of these impacts, as we highlighted in our report. We need to emphasize local context and knowledge, creating opportunities to learn from one another. For example, we demonstrated how the global majority shares significant common ground in terms of solution and strategies for this type of articulations and connections. So finally, global discussions on digital governments must emerge from this shared experience as the knowledge is built through understanding these local contexts and realities. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. That ends our presentation, and I really look forward to our discussion. Thank you, obrigado, and salamat, and we look forward to hearing from our 5 expert discussants.
Well, I'm going to hand us over to those 5 expert discussants in just a moment, but I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and see if I can ask a question or two of our 3 brilliant co-authors, along with a number of other co-authors who weren't presenting here. I want to start by drawing out something that I think can be non-obvious, which is just how much we've been able to learn from successful strategies in the global majority. And I think I want to call out more than anything else, Brazil's success in clawing back some creeping authoritarianism in an environment that, as Jonathan has mentioned, is one with a certain amount of authoritarian nostalgia. And I think a lot of the world is looking to Brazil and looking at responses to mis and disinformation to say, what did Brazil do so well? Jonathan hinted that some of this had to do with very broad, widespread coalitions. But maybe first from Raquel and then from Marcelo, I want to see if you could share some sort of lessons learned from 2022 in Brazil that maybe the rest of us can take some hope from as we think about the phenomenon of deconsolidating democracy. Raquel, what has Brazil done particularly well in combating mis and disinfo and allowing democratic dialogue to flourish?
So I would say that one of the key things that Brazil did right was the multiple coalitions, the diversity that we had in the coalitions allowed more people from civil society to have access to how the discussion was happening outside their bubbles. So I think this was very important for Brazil.
Thanks for that, Marcelo. Can I put the same question to you? What do you think Brazil did particularly well that we should be celebrating and learning from?
I think this is right, and there is also some kind of connection to institutional government, justice, and even the parliament that actually could enhance the power of decision of these coalitions. One of the problems that I pose, and we address this in the report, is how can we keep and maintain these coalitions? Because after the election or after Lula won, most of the funding, most of the organization, they were withdrawn from the country. So there is a real problem in the Brazilian case. When you have a successful case, an example, how can you maintain solidarities and keep coalitions, especially in the context of withdrawing funds and finance?
I think that's a great lesson, and I know that we have a number of folk who are paying attention to this from the funder community. And I will say that as someone who has been very active in the funder community over the years, I worked for many years with Open Society Foundation, there's a lot of very direct, actionable intelligence here. And I think that notion of helping maintain coalitions, not just in the moment of emergency, but between election cycles is super important. Jonathan, something I wanted to draw out from your work and JM's work that I think is just so helpful in this. You noted that the frames that we use to understand attacks on democracy are often US frames. They're Russia or China as the outside disinformation actor. And let's be clear, sometimes that's true. When we got to sit down with our friends from Moldova in Rio, they are profoundly affected by Russian disinformation. Much of your research has looked at disinformation for hire and the ways in which disinformation doesn't need to fit that old Cold War paradigm, but actually is much more sophisticated and complicated. What does reframing our understanding of disinformation and learning to see other actors in the global majority, how does that change how we view that field as a whole?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, people recognize it is a priority, but it's not the first priority for many of the countries that we interviewed, right? So these researchers are interested in that, but it's probably not the most, the highest on their list. So looking at disinfo for hire, I think opens up like a new avenue to really understand how disinformation thrives locally, right? So there's many different entry points for people to get hired within these firms, also exploited by local firms who offer this as a service, sometimes within a cloak of respectability. They don't have to be in a dark PR firm or like in the black market, but they operate within respectable public relations firms. And I think that's even more horrifying to think about, right? And also more challenging to also see the gray areas and not just binaries of good and bad, but where all of these complicity comes from. And I think a lot of my work is trying to spotlight and try to protect potential workers from getting hired by these firms. And I think that's where a lot of my advocacy has been over the past years, specifically in the Philippines. But I think this frame is especially relevant to the global majority and global majority countries where there's a lot of young people who are looking for an entry point to digital work. And this is, the kinds of firms that are hiring all the time, and especially when it comes to election season. So I think that is a very productive frame to think through.
It's such a helpful framing, Jonathan. As you know, I do a lot of work in West Africa. It's been super interesting to watch the rise of disinfo for hire in Nigeria. I think our colleague Seram Avile will be paying very close attention to disinfo for hire in Ghana's upcoming elections. I want to go to this amazing set of respondents we have, and I'm actually going to head to Africa for our first respondent. Herman Wasserman is professor of journalism and chair of the Department of Journalism at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He's published widely on African media. He's co-editor of a recent volume on disinformation in the Global South. Herman, I'm going to ask you to take about 5 minutes and just sort of react to the report. And I will probably jump in after about 5 minutes and try to bring you to heel if you're still going. But we're so happy to have you. Thank you for joining us and taking moments away from one of the most beautiful university towns in the world.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. And also thank you for this wonderful report. It's been really amazing to see this work coming to fruition, following some of your work and seeing how this has resulted in the report. I'll just say a few things. You've sent a few questions, so I'll structure my comments around those. But let me start by saying that I think firstly, again, congratulations on the report. I really enjoyed reading it. I think it makes an important invention in the discourses around technology, justice, information disorder, etc. What I also find really good about the report is that it leverages much broader discussions and strategies around decolonization of knowledge production, the whiteness of communication and tech studies, and focuses them on the discussion of platformization, information disorder, elections in the global south, the global majority. So I think it makes a very specific intervention in this field that we're working in, but at the same time also connects with much broader conversations that we should have around decolonization, etc. I think what the guiding principle here in the report is, which I really also very much appreciate, is that it invites us to examine questions around disinformation, tech justice, etc., within specific local contexts, within the particular social, economic, political, cultural pasts and presence. So it invites us to think about these questions and these issues within a broader history. Well, the first question that I was asked to sort of respond to is why it is important to support South-to-South network initiatives and projects like this one. And I think for me, the answer is that the Global South has so much to offer. The global majority has so much to offer in providing an environment to study the interrelationship between tech, social justice, and democracy. But when we say that, I think it is important, and this is what the report makes very clear, is that this is not a question of applying theories and applying questions that have been developed elsewhere and just use the South as a sort of petri dish, as a laboratory as a case study, as it's also been made very clear in the report. So the Global South regions of the Global South share many of the same histories: colonialism and post-colonialism, political conditions of authoritarianism and populism, social environments, things like pressure on freedom of expression, big economic inequalities. And all of these things, I think, are important to think about. It makes a strong case for comparing South-to-South and building South-to-South networks. But at the same time, as we see the decline, the backsliding of democratic backsliding in the global North, and I don't have to explain what that looks like. Very recent developments, but that the South can actually then offer lessons also to the North. A point that was also made very recently, I think also in this discussion and also in the report, is that the global majority is not a monolith. And this is also important to understand, that as we speak from a position of solidarity, the position of South-to-South research, that we also understand that there are regional centers and even sub-hegemons. And my country, South Africa, for instance, in the sub-Saharan African context, and you just mentioned West Africa, in the sub-Saharan African context, South Africa, for instance, is often dominates research agendas, and funding is often channeled to South Africa. And I think this is also important when we build these South-South networks, and when we think about South-South comparative work, that we also understand that there are power relations at work within these regions. So how I see researchers, policymakers, and funders to use the study and this proposed critical language around extraction, I think what is also important is here that the Global South is centered in the study. It's not, I've mentioned this before, but I think this is not used merely as a place where theories and models from the North gets applied, but where theory is built. And I think the report makes that very clear. I think that's maybe the most important point of departure, I think, that the report offers for further studies and further discussion, and also for the work of funders, is that this is an example of how theory is built from the bottom up, from the Global South and its specificities. So, and it also, the report, I think, prompts us, it actually demands of us to have contextual specificity, and also the real inclusion and agency that is important. So the study is focused on the lived experience of the majority world is, I think, really important. I think you're going to interrupt. Yeah, so
I am, but I'm going to interrupt you right at that lovely moment, because you've just emphasized what I think is such a fantastic contribution of the study, which is an insistence that we don't view the global majority as a space for case studies to apply theories from the North, but that we are looking to the majority for the theoretical frames, for the conceptual language that we end up using. And Herman, you also gave us some incredibly helpful language to sort of think about this, which I think is important to note. We're talking about some very large countries when we're talking about Brazil and the Philippines. We are talking, in the case of Brazil, as a regional hegemon, and as you pointed out, that there can be an overfocus on South Africa. There can be a danger of extrapolating too much from the experience of some large countries at the expense of some smaller ones, but really helpful in giving us some of this language around solidarity. I'm going to head to our next respondent in just a moment. I just wanted to remind people that the questions are open. We already have a terrific question that I'll be getting to by the end of the presentation. Please feel free to put in more. I want to bring in Dr. Nina Santos. Dr. Santos is a researcher at Alafia Lab. She holds a PhD from the Sorbonne. She's been involved with election integrity coalitions leading up to the 2022 Brazilian elections. She is quoted extensively by the study's authors within the report. Dr. Santos, I'd love to bring you into the conversation and see if we can get some thoughts from you about reactions to the report.
Thank you so much, Ethan, and hi, everyone. It is really great to see you all and to have the chance to participate in this discussion. Thank you. I would like to highlight that today, for the first time in history, we have a national holiday in Brazil devoted to Black Consciousness Day. So it's a very symbolic day to have this event. And although I have written my comments so I can better keep track of my time, I cannot start without acknowledging the amazing work done by Jonathan, Jose, Dean, Marcelo, Rafael, Raquel, and Camila. Your work not only adds to the current discussion, it challenges, it shifts, it defies what has been considered as established standards. And I'm sure at this moment in history, a shift is very much needed. That said, I would like to concentrate my comments in three main points of the report. The first one is the discussion about solutions to disinformation and digital harms should not be focused on the poor, marginalized, and vulnerable communities. The focus you give to the need to face disinformation from the top, as you call, and to avoid platform deterministic frames that talk down on communities' addictions, brainwashing, and the so-called vulnerable poor voters is very much needed. People are not voting on authoritarian leaders because they are manipulated by big tech. That does not mean that big tech and the way our digital world is structured today is not a problem. On the contrary, they are at the core of the problem, but as a part of a much larger, much bigger societal change. It has to do with inequalities, with a new economy and labor market, with the new forms of sociability and self-perception. None of that will be resolved only with content moderation, media literacy, and fact-checking. What leads us to my second point, the second point I would like to highlight. The reality we have today is the result of a very unequal globalization processes that affects different parts of the world in very different ways and intensities. The analysis brought by the report about the different actions to take in different societies points to an obvious but frequently disregarded challenge of our digital world. We cannot focus on the globality of the phenomenon and forget about how it takes place in the concrete reality of people's daily lives. That also means, arriving to my third and last point, that the discussion about the digital phenomena does not happen into a void. It is not only about big tech's regulation of digital platforms, online content, and data privacy, for instance. It has to do with institutions, courts, traditional and alternative media, social movements, political parties, and leaders. Speaking from the Brazilian experience, I can say with all certainty that institutional collaboration was and is essential to build and transform the digital world we live in. We saw that during our 2022 elections, when our electoral court played a central role in avoiding the free flow of disinformation campaigns, and we are at the eve of seeing the power of judicial institutions in Brazil again, since our Supreme Court should rule on platform responsibility next week after the inefficacy of our legislative houses to regulate the issue. So efforts for rethinking our digital reality should be more about understanding new social and political processes that take place in an era in the era that we live, and we live in a digital society. Big tech and platforms are more than malign actors that directly mislead people. They are an essential part of our contemporary society and infrastructure. Any action to transform this infrastructure into something that reinforces and not destroys democracy needs to take a much more complex and empowering view of than what we have today. And thank you very much for the opportunity of discussing with you.
Dr. Santos, thank you so much. That's a really sophisticated, helpful, enlightening take that I think breaks us out of this frame that if only these foreign tech platforms would do a better job of moderating, we would salvage democratic institutions. We are dealing with very complex topics, inequality, a transformed economy, the transformation of a broad range of institutions. We just had a question come in on our questions about the role of the state in all of this. Dr. Santos, you brought up the Brazilian electoral courts, which have been locked in a very interesting battle with arguably the world's wealthiest man at the moment. And so far, the electoral courts seem to be having the best of it, which is an interesting moment to talk about the power of the state. So very, very helpful for us in that. I want to go over to Paco Camacho. Paco is a human rights lawyer, a development worker based at the Asia Foundation in Manila. He works on bridging voices from social movements and civic collectives in Southeast Asia, in dialogues with bilateral donors, international development organizations to design localized democracy, law, and justice programs. Obvious why we would want his perspective on this report, as it really is interrogating some of the existing structures within that. Paco, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Good evening from Manila. Thank you to the authors of this thought-provoking study, which is both timely and essential. So I work for an international development organization across 18 countries in Asia, and we receive most of our funding from bilateral and multilateral donors. So in that sense, I'm both an audience and an object of critique for this study. And in the past 8 years, we have witnessed many different forms of tech and democracy and countering disinformation, funding opportunities. And in the narration of these opportunities, disinformation is often portrayed as an existential crisis that requires an all-hands-on-deck approach to avoid the threat to, the very fiber of a functioning society. But, this is not to undermine the threat and adverse impact of tech-facilitated repression or polarization. But in a time of polycrisis, with climate change and genocide and wars raging across the globe, I think there is harm in not treating civil society work as an intense and constant exercise in multitasking, of putting multiple fires in several front lines all at once. So as the study mentions, with the multiple challenges that civil society actors face, I really resonate with the idea that perhaps the best form of funding is to support these CSOs to just simply exist. So in my remarks, I'll share three main points of reflection. First is on the role of funders at this particular stage. And second, the value of engaging middle organizations within sort of the global aid industrial complex. And lastly, I'd like to share a note of concern about trends in foreign aid, which I think will be relevant to monitor moving forward. So, on to my first reflection. It's really hard for me to recall an established local organization, at least in the Philippines, that has focused solely on countering disinformation or improving information ecosystems. Most of these organizations that are currently in this space are either new or convened through foreign funding, or they're long-standing organizations that just recently included disinformation and tech and democracy as a new organizational priority or program. Mostly these are election integrity and media freedom focused organizations. So I think part of the mismatch is really that between donor agenda and the global majority development priorities perhaps really stems from the flavor of the money that funders have channeled towards tech and democracy programming. And within such a short time frame, many local organizations have had to pivot and build new programs to compete and secure funding to deliver impact to these donor-driven priorities. In the meantime, the more traditional work of building cohesion, service delivery, and holding power to account to address enduring challenges around human rights, economic development, press freedoms, and access to justice have never ceased. And so if tech and democracy, if not integrated into these equally important and ongoing work at the community level, will really only distract from the core mandates of global majority actors. My second reflection relates to middle organizations. So within the world of global North funders and the global aid industrial complex are these middle organizations that serve as intermediaries between large funding organizations and local civil society actors. These are often international organizations that receive large funding and in turn take on a sub-granting function in many different countries. There are many middle organizations with long histories of deep local presence who understand the political economy of democratic spaces they operate in. And while they are still key players and complicit in some of the shortcomings that the study points out, they do have a more direct and even trusting relationships with social movements and civic voice collectives in the global majority world. And so this calls for greater scrutiny, I believe, over how these middle organizations either reinforce or help level power imbalances, and how they should play a more proactive role in speeding up the localization agenda for tech and democracy programming. And so moving forward, I hope that these organizations can be integrated into future research or studies on tech and democracy. Lastly, I know I have reached the 5-minute mark, but I would like to raise a note of concern, and that what is worrying me right now is that there has been a growing trend towards awarding large multi-million contracts for global programs to multinational and sometimes even for-profit development organizations or consultancy firms. This trend concentrates funding, centralizes decision-making, and gatekeeps partnerships to a select, often predetermined consortium of favored international development organizations. This is problematic and should require more monitoring and critical engagement moving forward. So those are my remarks. Thank you again for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this very important study.
Paco, thanks so much for putting yourself up as both the object of critique and also offering your own critique coming in here. It's not easy necessarily to put oneself in that role. And let me also say, I really appreciate you making the case for service delivery organizations and the importance of that relationship to the ground. That feels very consonant with part of what the report is talking about in ensuring that the frames, that the theory is coming from the global majority rather than coming from the global north. I want to bring in Sabanaz Rashid Dia, who is the founder of Tech Global Institute. This is a global tech policy think tank focused on reducing gaps in equity and accountability between tech companies and the global majority. Obviously, an issue that we're talking about here. She's advised governments and multilateral organizations on policy questions related to global internet and platform governance, responsible AI, and human rights. Sabanaz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ethan. It's been a while I've been called Sabanaz, but that's, no, it's fine. That's also my first name, but I usually go by Dia, but thank you for having me. And first of all, I just want to congratulate the co-authors of this report because as someone who's followed this space for a long time, I mean, I found the insights extremely valuable, and I think it challenges our own assumptions in many ways. And I think it's really important that as we're not reflecting only on the holistic sort of industry of disinformation or tech and democracy, but also our own selves in the civil society space. And I think it pushes us to do both at the same time. So I really appreciate many of the nuances that this report brought through. I guess I have sort of 3 points of reflection building off Paco's excellent structuring, which I think I felt when I was reading this report, which builds on some of the questions that was sent earlier. I think the first is, in the report kind of lays out big tech, sort of, global philanthropy and sort of bilateral funding. But I think I'm going to add 2 more players to the mix, which I think is quite important for a global majority. First is big NGOs, large international human rights organizations who have deep sort of expertise in some of the markets, but also tend to Paco's point, often act as intermediaries. They're in the human rights space, they're in the development space, but I think that is also a point of power asymmetry, which needs to be discussed. And I think the second is multilateral organizations. And I think we talk a lot about bilateral aid in this report, but not so much. I think a little bit we touch on sort of the UNs of the world, but I think that continues to also be, I would say, both a source of power and power asymmetry in many of these markets. So if I could just sort of deep dive a bit on both, I think, as we interrogate the space for tech and democracy, I think it's also important to start, I would say, questioning where people get power from, right? And I think that determines in many ways how we engage with the entire space. And if it's a grassroots organizations or whether, I mean, the power comes from access to either a larger organization or a funder or a big tech entity. And I think that power relationship itself is quite symmetrical, is quite problematic because they're not getting powers from each other, they're getting powers from a source, from the very source that they're trying to hold accountable. And I think that in many ways, I think distorts how we think about relationships and how we think about engagement and how we think about accountability. I think the second is, particularly in terms of the role of multilateral groups. I mean, in many of these spaces, particularly in the global majority, the way to access international forums, international negotiations, because the global north-south disparity exists, is through the UN. And we've seen efforts, particularly this year, what has been most disappointing for me personally, has been how every single road led to the UN. Whether it was disinformation, whether it was tech regulation, whether it was AI, somehow the UN was in the mix of everything. And as somebody who has always been quite critical of multilateral as a way of getting into countries and as a way of determining what needs to happen, what doesn't need to happen, I think that shifting of conversation, the shifting of power is very concerning. And the fact that many of the local organizations, even if there is a campaign that pushes back on these domestically, the same groups also end up partnering with the UN organizations in the country to either get access to resources or to build sort of legitimacy in a more regional or international space. And I think that needs to also be interrogated in terms of where is the UN in this particular space? What role are they playing? Are they actually building domestic capacity, or in many ways undermining domestic capacity in terms of and establishing themselves as almost like a pseudo civil society without actually being one? And I think that requires some critical thinking as well. I think the second point I have is around, and the report kind of touches a bit on whistleblower protections and sort of other alternative ways of intervention. I think that's really important. One of the things, and I think that is perhaps a function of being in authoritarian and distrustful environments, is oftentimes, because of these reasons, it's hard to engage new players and new actors, and also non-traditional players and non-traditional actors. And I think there's a real opportunity there, and I think that also goes in the whistleblower aspect. In the global north, we see a lot of this, what we call the revolving door phenomenon. You have people moving from tech to civil society to government, and you have a lot of that turning around. It has its limits and it has its perils, and we don't see that so much in the global majority because there's so much of distrust that exists in that space. And I think in some ways, while it's important to be critical and be constructive, I also think it's a missed opportunity in terms of engaging in some of those frameworks to be able to find alternative points of intervention. And I think having sort of a fractured environment where you have civil society, government, and sort of private sector in very widening silos, at the end of the day, I think it in many ways limits our ability to be effective. And so I think it is important to kind of start thinking about psychological safety, even within the civil society, even within the sort of tech for democracy space. Can new players come in? What are the conditions for engagement? How do we engage traditional groups? One of the, I think in my experience, the best lessons I've learned for tech and democracy are actually from labor unions and trade unions, not from digital rights groups, not from human rights groups, but actually groups that have been on the front lines, that have talked about labor worker justice for a long, long time. The other point of lessons that I've learned is from climate justice groups. Almost feels like in a big tech, big oil, there's a lot of that, there are lessons in that space. And I think oftentimes we don't engage the more traditional actors in a way that would actually enable us to think more about power structures, decolonization, and sort of influence in this particular space. So I think perhaps being able to think about the entire sort of tech and democracy space as a point where there's psychological safety even within civil society, there's space for new actors, and there's opportunity for, I would say, whistleblowers from across different spaces to be able to engage with each other meaningfully, opens up a whole new space of advocacy that I think hasn't been explored as much. And the last point I'm going to make is around, I'm going to be super quick on the 30%, I promise, is around coalition building. And I think and I think there's a lot of advice for funders to, particularly in very hostile environments, to talk about trust as a function of coalition building. And I think it's also important to recognize that trust goes both ways, right? And I think it's important to recognize that trust cannot be forced or imposed on people. Trust takes a very long time to build. And even within the human rights space, I encourage us to think about the space not as, tech is bad, funders are, like the good, bad kind of dichotomy, and move and start questioning even our own communities. Are these spaces equally safe for women and LGBTQ and minorities, right? And so being able to see trust as a function of historical, political societies and structures, and then using that as a reference point to build trust slowly, I think is also quite critical as funders think about moving forward in South-South cooperation. I'm going to pause here. Sorry, I took 30 minutes, 30 seconds extra. Sorry, Ethan.
Thanks so much, and thank you for raising this question of asymmetries of power and where power comes from in this space. And I think that analysis that power comes from funding, it comes from access to the platforms, access to government, it comes from all sorts of different places. Understanding who has access to those powers, how those asymmetries focus. And I love the sort of actionable suggestion of trying to make it possible for whistleblowers and other people who are under threat to draw some connections and draw together. We've got one more respondent who I want to bring into the conversation, but I also just wanted to remind people that there is the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. We've got a couple of questions. I'm going to be going to those in just a moment. But I would encourage you, if you have questions for the authors of the report, please to go ahead and use that. I'm going to bring in Danita Putri, who's a director at Luminate. Luminate is a global foundation with a strong focus on the global majority, lots of work around democracy under threat and access to information. Danita is focused on the organization's portfolio in Asia and comes in with a background in policy, privacy, and data protection in regional and international contexts. Danita, I would love your reactions on the report thus far.
Thank you, Ethan. It's hard to be the last because there's a very tight time, and all my points have been communicated by the previous ones, but I wanted to focus on perhaps the role of funders and how can we take this responsibility. And of course, I really appreciate the results from this research and the sharp recommendations. I even learned a lot myself during the process of this research and over the discussions with Jonathan, of course. So let's admit there's a power imbalance there, power asymmetry, as Dia has said, and I think the way I see it, global philanthropy has a vital counterbalancing role in the power imbalance of tech industry investment and funding, as well as in supporting and promoting the global majority work. And we do it in Luminate, we do it solely not through providing support, but also by taking an ecosystem approach, building the field and strengthening the field, responding to the needs, like doing not a top-down approach, but a bottom-up approach as recommended by this research. Like if we talk about big tech, what do we mean by big tech in our context in Asia? What do we mean by disinformation in our context in Asia? What do we mean by tech accountability in our context? Like, how do you do tech accountability in a country that's still struggling with democracy? We are not even finished safeguarding our civic space and countering the repressions, for example. And on that note, I also want to talk about the metrics of success, because this is how we take our responsibility as a funder. I really agree that we have the responsibility to model and mainstreaming the different metrics of success beyond scalability or feasibility and more towards like empowerment and ecosystem growth. And success is not always shiny. As Pacho has rightly said, that maintaining civic space and existing, like making sure that they exist, is a success in itself, especially in Asia, where most of the countries are still operating under authoritarian government. And it's not shiny. Like I can say that my success in this portfolio is that, you know, like human rights organizations are still existing. But that is actually super huge in this context. And we have to model that. And we also want to provide a tailor-based support beyond the programmatic needs, like protections for researchers and lawyers, assisting scholars and activists at risk to build their credibility and expertise, for example. And if Jonathan got being doxxed as a result of his research, what can we do? What can we do to assist him? Should we provide some support? And how can I protect researchers like Dia and her team when doing the work against big tech companies, for example? We also need to think about that. And I think the recommendations really speaks to me on that. And the terms of success beyond scalability, I think a lot of donors have started using this approach. Feminist donors, for example, they're really geared towards ecosystem growth. And I think this ecosystem approach is not without a challenge for us as well as for the partners, because activities like space building, trust building, as Dia said, between organizations and researchers, not only in one continent or in one regions, but also like across regions, it takes time. They're not short term, they're not even medium term, they're long term. It needs commitment, persistence, patience to see the results. And also it prompts us, the funders, an ability for us to take risks and allowing rooms for us to make mistakes and for partners to make mistakes and learn from it. And it's not a very mainstream approach, I might say, because once we are communicating our way of funding to our partners in the global majority, they are still also stuck with the numbers game in terms of implementing the programs. They are used to short project-based funds. And because of that, oftentimes they don't think about organizational growth or networking as priorities. So we need to really like encourage them to think about, how do you want to grow? How do you want to network with other organizations from Brazil or the Philippines or, you know, other countries? So I guess one of the things that I would like Jonathan and also other researchers to look at is, how do we change this mindset as well from the civil society organizations and the researchers, and not to just like, you know, running into like from one project to another, but to pause and to think about like, how do we grow? How can we grow? How can we network? And funder plays an important role, because, you know, how we design our programs and our funding, it really, really impact that space to pause and to think. And Luminate has been doing that. And I think a lot of funders are trying to do that, but it's not easy to change that. I can admit that. So I really hope that this research will be amplified more. And I'm happy to be like an ambassador for this research and take it to another funders colleague of mine. Last bit is, I know the trends in tech justice and tech democracy globally are not looking good at the moment. And I really agree that in tackling this problem, we also need to tackle a lot of bigger problems that we have in society. But if we improve and expand this global majority network, maybe the solutions will come from us. So that's from me. Thank you so much. I'm giving back the floor to Ethan.
Danita, thanks so much. And I know that it's a tough position to be in that final seat. I want to say that not only in your comments, but in some ways the story of Luminate is an interesting story of trying to decenter the North, and particularly technological platforms, in thinking about how we approach these things. We're literally talking about an organization that, when Pierre Omidyar began his philanthropy as the creator of a large technology platform, he created a new technology platform and then told all of his, grantees to go ahead and use it. That's now more than a decade in the past. We've seen things like Luminate sort of emerge from that space and now become much, much closer to and working on organizing, bringing together organizations in the field, bringing those voices to the fore. So it's wonderful to hear you sort of talking about some of those theories. We have a few minutes left here, particularly since we started a couple minutes late. I want to bring in some of these great questions that have come in. I'm not going to read them word for word. I'm going to summarize a little bit, and then I'm going to toss them back to the report's authors. Although if anyone else wants to come in on that, if you've got something particularly germane, please feel free. Daniel Trielli asks a set of questions about Brazil's success and resiliency around the 2022 elections, wondering very specifically about the strength and independence of Brazil's courts, and asking about Brazilian media. And particularly frames these indifferences between Brazil and the United States. It's not hard to draw a contrast there between authoritarians returning to power in the United States, authoritarians being kept from power in Brazil. Could I ask our Brazilian team in particular to sort of comment on maybe some of those perceived differences in news media and the judiciary, and sort of roles in protecting democratic institutions in the 2022 elections?
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Daniel. I'll address the first question. So, Daniel, I would say the Supreme Court in Brazil, they played a central role, especially interfacing with the coalitions that fought against disinformation. It was a very specific characteristic of an active organization of the electoral process that the Supreme Court has, especially enacting rules about media consumption here in Brazil. The Supreme Court also signed multiple agreements with all the digital platforms before the national election in 2022. This was decisive not only to remove accounts, but also in persecuting and jailing insurgents during November and December encampments in the front of the barracks of the armed forces here in Brazil. Nowadays, Bolsonaro is not eligible for office due to crimes against the electoral law. And this opens the possibility for rearrangement of the political coalitions and leadership in the far right. New leaders are emerging and trying to challenge the hegemony of Bolsonaro in the far right within the Brazilian political parties. However, we discussed at length in the workshops how this model is not by itself reproducible, replicable, and can pose multiple harms in different political contexts, risking empowering authoritarians and curbing free speech. So that was very specific to Brazil. And in the context of this recent news that broke on the plot against the plot from the military force to try to assassinate the president and vice president and the Supreme Electoral Court Judge Alexandre de Moraes in Brazil, we can understand how this role was decisive, not only against disinformation, but against this really entrenched political culture of violence and military violence here in Brazil that extends from the military dictatorship in the 1974.
Marcelo, that's incredibly helpful. Raquel, I'd love to hear from you on that as well, if we could.
I'll make a quick comment about the second question and taking from Marcelo's answer. So the Supreme Court was very important in Brazil, not just because they had these actions, but because they presented like an institutional counter-discourse against the idea of fraud and the disinformation that was happening in the country. And because they were acting, the news were talking about the opposition. And this created, like, challenged the discourse, for example, about the fraud, about how, about the far right radicalization. So there was opposition. You did not have just the radicalized discourse circulating. I don't know how, I didn't follow how the news covered the US very closely, but the differences in Brazil from 2018 when Bolsonaro was elected and 2022 were very striking in the news coverage, because the news were much more critical. They were much more critical of disinformation. They were challenging publicly the disinformation that the far right was presenting. And that did not happen in 2018.
I think that notion of an institutional counter-narrative is really valuable and really worth considering seriously. I also have to say, Marcelo, the notion that someone could be made ineligible for office due to crimes against electoral law, that's a clever idea. I'm going to pass that on to some colleagues in the United States. I wonder if that might be useful here in my country. Really interesting idea. All these things I'm learning from South-South Global Majority Partnerships. I'm going to take one more question before I let us go, just because I think it's really on point for a lot of issues that we care about. I'm going to rephrase it, but it's from Darsana Vijay. And Darsana raises the foreign contributions regulations in India. And this is where the state is imposing limits on international funding for grassroots NGOs. The logic behind this is to avoid foreign interference. But of course, what it often ends up doing is crippling NGOs that have become reliant on international support, often are doing that most important service delivery on the ground. We've seen this not just in India. Obviously, this was enormously important in Russia while that was still pretending to be an open society. It's become a very popular tactic. I would love it if any of the authors had any thoughts on workarounds, responses, something that we might be able to do against this technique, which is increasingly challenging for civil society and the global majority.
Well, this was definitely a concern. We had Indian workshop participants who obviously felt a lot of concern, even being part of those discussions, right? And I think the idea of like civil society at risk, I think a lot of our civil society collaborators from India have experienced this most acutely. I'm actually super curious. There are formal but also more informal strategies to get around it. And I hesitate to be so specific around them. And I wonder whether including like our donors perhaps might have like more practical strategies around some of these issues, which obviously carry with it a lot of like legal concerns. And I think that's super important to acknowledge.
I don't know if any of the donors want to jump in on this. I'm also going to note that it is a sensitive issue. I will say that one of the things that feels to me like an obvious follow-up to this conversation is a dead practical conversation at some point about doing challenging work at a moment of democratic deconsolidation. So at moments where people are facing doxing, facing other threats, when defunding through mechanisms like this ends up coming onto the table. We had a question about creating coalitions instead of grassroots work. I think this is a place where a lot of global majority South-South learning could be really helpful around that. So for the funders in the room taking note on that, I think there would be a lot of enthusiasm for a discussion like that. I'm going to try to honor the time that everyone's given us and try to bring us to a close at this point. I have to say this has been one of the liveliest discussions I've heard in some time. I've learned so much from it. I'm really grateful to everyone who's been able to attend our event. I'm especially grateful for those calling in from Asia because it's late night at this point. I just want to say we would love to interact with you, collaborate with you. You can connect with us at glowtechlab.net and we can find different ways to collaborate. Congratulations to all of the paper's authors, particularly the ones who are here with us today, but all of the folk who have put this together. Congratulations and thank you to all the respondents we were able to have, and many, many thanks to everyone who was able to join us here today. It really has been wonderful to see everyone. Jonathan, do you want a final word?
Well, thank you, Ethan. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Yeah, just wanted to share, when doing the study and interviewing, participants, and we always ask them, what's the project that you're most proud about? They often talk about the space and the community that they have built. And I think that's what helped us frame our project around the spaces and projects kind of distinction. that's what people often remember, the relationships that they've cultivated. And I think there's a lot to say around the importance of space building and south-to-south network building. Yeah, I think that's been really the most enriching part of this, being in community with the people here. Marcelo, Raquel, and the rest of you here. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful night. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you so much for sharing time with us. Goodbye.
Thank you, Ethan.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks for
It
having
went
us.
amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Your
Oh,
work is
my
very
pleasure.
important, and the way you managed this was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really, really happy to take part.